So welcome to my newbie Dead by Daylight video. This isn't going to cover everything in the game, but it is going to cover a handful of things that I would have loved to have had explained to me or pointed out to me when I was new to Dead by Daylight and just started playing. So yeah, let's get into it. You want to immediately assess where you're located in the map and make a few observations about where you've started out. Immediately I notice I've got a locker, I've got a pallet right here, and some jungle gym stuff going on. I've got another one over here. So I've got a lot of stuff to work with, and I immediately see Killer Shack. Now really first priority should be finding a generator and getting on it as soon as possible. Now just glancing around, I'm not spotting one. So I'm going to push inward towards Shack because I've got a lot of pallets and loops and whatnot to work with, and I see there's a generator there in the distance. But one thing I do know, and there's another one to my left, so they're about the same distance apart. So at this point I could kind of take my pick. I'm just going to run to this one, because we've got this school bus we could possibly work with too, and immediately start working on the generator. So priority number one is to get on a gen as fast as possible and start working toward the objectives on it. The other thing you want to pay attention to, obviously aside from generators, is you want to start asking yourself, all right, where do I go from here? And not just in terms of what do I work on next, but in terms of where do I go if the killer shows up? So I've got pallets kind of all around me. I've got a lot of stuff to work with. You also want to keep an eye out for totems as well. But generators should be the top priority. Something that new players don't really focus on a whole lot, I was guilty of this, is kind of how strong or how weak is the pallet in question. And what I mean by that is the objects around the pallet, are they strong for looping the killer on? So if you get in chase and you're being chased by the killer, like is this object here super viable for outrunning the killer without using the pallet on them to stun them or block them or whatnot? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of objects like these are, can you see over or through them? So can you keep an eye on the killer while you're running around the object in question? Now these barrels here would be a big fat yes, right? Because you can see the killer on the other side of this. It's not really blocking the field of view on the killer or anything. As far as length of this, I mean, this is doable, but it's not super strong by itself. The killer is likely to catch up to you pretty quickly. Probably aren't going to get a whole lot of loops on the killer before you're forced to drop the pallet down on him, and so on. Now, a note about dropping the pallets themselves. A lot of times killers will just immediately kick these and break them, especially if you stun them. But sometimes they won't bother to do that, and you can capitalize on the size of the object you've created by putting this pallet down. So before we just had these barrels, which was kind of short, but now that we've dropped this pallet down, we've bridged these two static objects together, right? So we've got a much longer object we can potentially run around now, instead of just that one small short section of barrels. And if a killer decides to pursue you on something like this, you have a really strong advantage if he doesn't break that pallet and decides to just chase you. And that kind of principle is something you want to apply to really any pallet you happen to see, or especially if you're working on a generator near any kind of pallet. You want to kind of look at and evaluate how strong the static structures are, like these barrels by themselves without the pallet down, as well as with the pallet down, and then kind of make a judgment call based on that as well. Sometimes I will skip one generator and go to another, because the generator might be kind of off by itself without any pallets or structures around it to help me with the chase. And I'll go find a generator that's got stronger map objects around it to work on, so it's a little bit safer. So that's kind of the general premise of stronger and weak pallets. Now, I would say this is a pretty strong pallet when it's dropped. So definitely a good choice, especially with the gen right here working on it. And you've also got Killer Shack over here, which always has a pallet in it, at least in the beginning of the game. And you can loop around the building. And I'll go into that after a little bit as well. So first priority, find a gen, work it. Keep an eye out for pallets, because those are your exit plans, right? What direction are you going to go? If the killer comes from this direction, where do I go? If the killer comes from this direction, where do I go? If he comes from behind me, that's not behind me. If he comes from behind me, where do I go? And calculate where you're going to run to next based off of that. Another thing you want to keep an eye on is the status indicators at the bottom left of your screen that has the portraits of the survivors. So if you start out at the beginning of the game, you're working a gen, you haven't had any audio cues of where the killer is. If you're running Spine Chill, it's not lighting up, so the killer's not really looking your direction. If it seems like the killer's not around, but you notice that the status indicator of a survivor in the bottom left is injured, it's likely that other survivor is in chase and is preoccupying the killer. So you have some time to continue work on your generator or whatever it is you're doing. So always pay attention to that as well. And another note about pallets, to get the most value out of a pallet, ideally you want to try to loop the killer or engage in chase with the killer around the static objects of the map before you drop the pallet in question. So kind of in a perfect scenario, you'd want to be running around these barrels, and you want to run around these as many times as possible. There might be some mind gaming going on where the killer changes direction, you have to go the opposite direction, things like that. Ideally you would do this for as long as possible before you finally drop the pallet for a stun if the killer gets close, so that you preserve the life of that pallet as long as possible, because a lot of times the killer will just go ahead and break the pallet. If he doesn't break the pallet, now you've got a much stronger loop to work with. But in general, you want to try to maximize the value of the static objects in the map of the game before you go ahead and drop that pallet. Always something to keep in mind. Another thing that I was also somewhat guilty of, and I still do it from time to time when I'm just screwing around in the map and having fun, a lot of times you'll have a good lead on a killer. So you get a lot of distance on him. And you'll glance over your shoulder and the killer's still a ways away, but you're at this pallet. And a lot of folks will stop here. They'll stop at a pallet, maybe they'll hide. And then as the killer gets closer, they'll run over and try to slam the pallet down. Now from like an efficiency standpoint, it's really not the best use of your time, right? Because you're just sitting and waiting for him to catch up to you. Ideally, if you had the distance, you would skip this pallet you're on, and you make your way to another pallet instead, thus preserving one of the pallets behind you. At this point, the killer might be closer to you, so now you can work the running around this shack building, which we'll talk more about specifically in a little bit. So don't always be just jumping from one pallet to the next pallet. You have to consider the distance the killer is from you, and of course the type of killer, right? Because ranged attack killers and all that, things get a little bit different. But if I'm here and the killer is well past that gen I was just working on, it would actually make more sense for me to push on to another section of the map with other pallets and window vaults and opportunities to break line of sight, instead of running to the pallet and just camping and waiting for him to show up and then running it. It's a mistake I see a lot of people make, and it's something I used to do at times when I was just starting out. You'll often hear the terms strong and weak pallets thrown around, and you'll also hear the term God pallet thrown around. So typically a weak pallet is a pallet that isn't super conducive to looping well with. So when this pallet's dropped, it's relatively strong from having to run around this pallet along with the static map objects included with it. So weaker pallets are those pallets that are present with shorter map objects next to them. That would be considered a weaker pallet because it's really difficult to loop without dropping the pallet, and once you drop that pallet and use it up, even if the killer ignores breaking the pallet and chases you, the risk of you getting hit in any capacity is a lot greater than on a stronger pallet, because on a stronger pallet you've just got more distance to work with. God pallet is often referenced in regard to the killer shack, which is in this map is this here. And the reason this is called a God pallet is because the options for the killer to get to you when this is dropped are minimized. If you drop this while you're outside the shack and the killer's inside, they can waste the time to break the pallet, which gives you time to move on. They can vault through the window, which is slower. They have to backtrack to do it, which gives you time to move on. Or they can backtrack through the doorway, come around the sides of the building to get you while you can move on. So extremely strong, right? Generally, they're kind of forced to break the pallet and move on or risk losing a lot of time in the process. So note on looping, or the chase, which the game tutorials don't really go into much of at all. There's a couple of things that I want to discuss. The first one is this mistake. and that's not looking behind you while you run. And this can be practiced pretty easily. You can do this in a tutorial, actually, without doing a Kill Your Friends custom map. But looking behind you gives you so much information on where the killer is and what they're doing. But I see a lot of new players, and even players that have been playing a long time, just constantly run forward. They don't look behind them. So they have no idea what the killer's doing, where they're positioning themselves, or even if they've veered off to chase someone else. So always focus on learning how to run effectively while looking over your shoulder. And you're not going to have to do it the whole time. But the longer you can do this without having to just look straight forward without seeing anything behind you, the more information you're going to have and the more control you're going to have over the situation when you're in chase. Because the whole goal of the chase is to waste as much time of a killer as possible so that your teammates can work on generators, which ultimately gets you to the exit gate and gets you out of the match. Also, with looping, a mistake I made when I started out is I tended to float around the map objects a little too far. And this actually works to your disadvantage in chase, because if the killer hugs the objects and the pallets and whatnot around you as they're chasing you, they can catch up to you. So the tighter you can hug any map objects in a loop, the more quickly or the more efficiently you're going to be able to escape a killer when they're chasing you. So that's something else you have to work on. Now you combine that with looking over your shoulder and hugging the objects of the map as tightly as possible, are going to improve your chase game. So another topic is window vaults. And there's 3 different types of vaults. There's a slow vault, which is stealthy, doesn't make any noise. There's a medium vault, which is like a slow vault but makes noise. You move a little bit quicker. And then there's the fast vault, which is more like the parkour style. Practicing consistent fast vaults makes a big difference in chase as well when the killer's chasing you. Practicing on Killer Shack is pretty helpful. I mean, you can find any window vault and run this. If you can do Kill Your Friends, there's lots of people on Discord servers and whatnot that volunteer to fire up empty servers like this and let you practice and mess around. And doing loops on Killer Shack is kind of twofold. One, it gets you used to doing the fast vaults. It lets you practice looking behind you as you're running and vaulting. And it helps you practice kind of hugging the structure in chase to be more efficient with how you run. So practicing kind of by yourself in a lower stress environment on Killer Shack is really helpful for that. And I noticed a lot of improvement in my chase after doing some of these like drills with Killer Shack, jumping through windows, changing direction while looking behind me, hugging the structures as much as possible. Those kind of things made a big difference over time. So with Killer Shack in particular, with looping it, there's a few things. One thing I like to focus on when you're in chase is kind of peeking these corners where the 2 walls intersect with each other. You can stand close to one of these intersections and kind of watch both sides if you lose sight of the killer. And a lot of times you can catch glimpses of the killer through the cracks or the little slots in the shack wall as well. And ultimately, you want to do your best to get as many loops around and through the building as much as possible before you're actually forced to drop this. A lot of times, I'll commit to the shack for a little while, and once I get line of sight broken with the killer, I'll just peel off and go somewhere else. If he's like way back there and I have no view on him, I'll peel off and leave the shack altogether. I do my best to try to preserve that palette in most cases. And plus, you run into blind spots at times. You start questioning yourself the longer the chase goes on. And so I may peel off and try to find a stronger palette loop where I can actually see over the structures like here with the barrels and whatnot, and drop this down instead and start working it. Another thing that's super common with new players, and I was guilty of this too, is the map edges. Avoid the map edges. A lot of people go with like the immersed, sneaky kind of setup when they start out, and they end up in places like this, where they're kind of on the edges of the map and they don't have a lot of RNG necessarily super close to them. Now there's a pallet here in this case, so it's not too bad. But in general, you want to be careful with sticking to the outer fringes all the time. Because if you get stuck out in a location where you just got like these rocks and trees and these kind of useless walls that we have up here, if you get caught out here, the likelihood of you getting injured or downed is higher because you have nothing really to run to. You end up having to kind of run inward into the map to get to something safe. So avoid that, and of course, If you end up running around the edge of the map, you're lighting up that whole wall with scratch marks. Now, most people that end up on the edges of the map are running like urban evasion or, stuff that's more conducive to like crouch walking around or walking around. You have to be really careful with running around walls because they'll light it up like a Christmas tree, and that's a lot easier to spot on a wall from a distance than the ground scratch marks, especially with the fog. The whole thing with being on the map edges and not having like pallets and window vaults or lockers to hide in, it's called like being zoned out. You don't have anything really good to work with in the zone. You want to get back to something that has map objects or map RNG that you can work with to break line of sight and hide, and of course pallets that you can drop to improve your chase chances. And then just a final word on ranking up, or as you're making your way from rank 20 to rank 1. There's kind of a general rule I've heard from a few different people, a few different places that's pretty solid, and that's a rule of 2. So you apply the rule of 2 to everything you do in the map. 2 generators, 2 totems, 2 good chases, 2 safe unhooks, 2 full, ideally, or lengthy heals, and it's likely that you'll pip up or improve your rank. It's kind of a general rule you can apply. If you've done 2 full gens, like with no help, pretty safe to say that your objective score is going to be pretty good. So you might want to shift your focus to unhooks and healing, which is going to apply to your altruism. Likewise, if you've done nothing but objective and healing and there's been really no chase, you definitely want to cleanse some totems for boldness points and get into some good chases, ideally chases that you escape from, and ideally chases that you don't get hit on. But you just kind of have to shift your thinking around and change what your focus is, objective-wise, depending on what you've already accomplished in the game. And that's the likelihood of you ranking up is going to be greater with that approach. Oh, and then finally, don't be afraid to get into chase and experiment with it. I kind of wish when I started I wasn't taking the scaredy cat route and doing the immerse plays around the edges of the map all the time. It'll help desensitize you to the stress and maybe any anxiety you have that the game likes to kind of induce with the music and the killers chasing you and all that. And you'll just find that you're able to react more collected and calm when those chases come up in the future. Anyway, I hope the video was helpful, and if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and I will see you later.